Hello, everyone. Welcome to our woodland walk for the month of May. And today we have the author, Lucy Jones, author of the book Matrescence, with us. Hello, Lucy.
Hello, it's lovely to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Lucy's book, Matrescence, is I think, one of the most important books I've ever read and has incredible significance for building more connected ways of living, more connected communities, more connection to ourselves, to nature, to the world around us. It was so in line with the themes that we work with in ASA that even though it's about motherhood, it's about motherhood and so much more. So Lucy, incredible respect to you for writing this absolute, well, I was good saying masterpiece, but mistress piece instead.
Thank you. That means so much.
So we're talking about your book Matrescence in the context of the month of May, which is our introduction to the Douglas Fir tree, which is the mother tree. And the Douglas Fir trees, you can read about it in the amazing book Finding the Mother Tree by Susan Simard. She talks about these connectedness of between the trees and the community of trees underneath the forest floor, where all the mycelial connected and they support each other, they offer each other care and resources and information, and they just create this kind of village ecosystem where they're working together. And so in the month of May, we focus a lot about how we can nurture our local connectedness to people in our lives, and nurture our compassionate networks where we support each other. And so when I was reading your book, and we'll talk a lot about in this chat about, I suppose, the three phases of birth and then postnatal period, and then also kind of moving forward as mothers. But it just made me feel about how through each of those stages, the village, the mother tree network we need in our culture is sorely missing. So, Lucy, first of all, could you maybe just reflect a little bit on this idea, because I know that you've been writing about ecology as well as motherhood, and you've been writing about science and health. And what when I talk about the Douglas fir tree, and that kind of image, I know that the images of mycelium through your book, you have all these beautiful nature images. What comes to mind? What comes up when I say about the Douglas fir mother trees?
What a great question, and a great beginning. Well, I suppose that the initial visual image I have is um, of threads, kind of the mycelial threads, the mycorrhizal networks branching out from the underneath of the mother tree and going in all kinds of directions. And it also makes me think how, um, for me, becoming a mother and matrescence was an experience of like total ecological awakening in some ways. And when I think about the Douglas fir, which is such a kind of image of how everything is interconnected and how the trees look after its kin, its young, and help each other and so on and work in cooperation. It astounds me that I got to the age of, I was 31 when I had my first child, and I was um so kind of marinated in ideas of self-reliance and self-sufficiency and independence and autonomy and freedom. And it took that giving birth and having a child for me to break that myth and that fiction that I think is often so dominant in our culture, and to realize that, well, that's an inadequate way of thinking. It's a lie. And we're just the same as the trees and the creatures in the soil. We're just as connected. We're all ecological beings. Um, so yeah.
You One of the things from your book that really stayed with me is a quote about some kind of dictionary definition about what life is about. It's like it's self-sustaining, and you make the point that we're not self-sustaining, we are sustained by our environment.
Yes, that's a great quote. That was a guy called Nick Lane, I think. and yeah, he argues with this so I think it's the NASA definition of life, which it uses the word self-sustaining. Um, it also makes me think of Scott Gilbert and these ideas of parts and wholes. And another scientist I quote in Matrescence, um, who talks about how, like, I think he says something like 20th century biology is one of kind of atoms or pieces and parts, whereas we're moving into a much more connected understanding of that the matrix within which an organism thrives, lives, is part of it. Is it can't exist without its matrix. Um, so yeah, that was a surprise to me when I was, I was absolutely thrilled to be pregnant and have a baby, but I thought that pregnancy would be a bit like my body was like a box or a pot, and that the baby would come out and then I'd be the same person. Um, and of course, that wasn't the case, and it was a big learning journey for me in realizing our kind of relational reality, um, and relational reality with the more than human as well.
Yes. And before we start, so we'll talk about. I'd like us to talk first about birth, the process of birth, because obviously for our community, it's a community of people engaging in psychedelic integration, and I'd like us to think a little bit about the kind of parallels between birth, as in labor, childbirth, and psychedelic experiences, and to talk about maybe about our births and the way the individualistic culture that we're in and the very mechanistic culture, how that has affected the way we birth and the way we birthed and the myths that we were the myths in the teachings that we received growing up. But before we do, I just wanted to say as well that I know that this conversation around pregnancy and birth and babies can be incredibly difficult for people for all sorts of different reasons as well, and that anyone that's listening to this who might have lots of trauma around wanting to have been a mum and that not happening, or the loss of a baby, or the loss of a pregnancy, or any of those reasons that people can feel this is incredibly hard, is that this is our conversation will be a little bit about birth, but mostly I think it's going to be about politics. So stick around, stick with us, and sending just lots of solidarity to anyone who's listening to this and feeling heavy-hearted and sad. We don't have enough places in our culture to talk about these things, talk about any of these things. So we know that often people hold the trauma around this without having spaces to share it. So in our community, we have sharing circles regularly. So if this brings up any of that stuff for anyone listening, you know that you have your reflection circles and your sharing circles and your orchard groups. So yeah, hopefully this can lead to some full-hearted conversations. So firstly then, birth. Will you tell us a little bit about your first birth, and maybe around the kind of the context you give in your book around how birthing was before the kind of the hospitals and the kind of patriarchal just like decision making around how birth should be changed everything, and then how it is now?
Yeah, sure. I think birth is probably the most complex and complicated of all the subjects that I write about in my book. And matrescence and the research that I did for the book is very subjective. It's very much from my own point of view and about my own experiences. And there are so many ways of giving birth. There are so many ways of being a mother, being a non-mother. But my experience was that I had absorbed the idea that natural childbirth, so vaginal birth, with no or very little pain relief was the ideal. And I absorbed the idea that if I did my breathing exercises, I wouldn't feel very much pain. I sensed that my culture was telling me that birth wasn't really a big deal, but just to get through it and try and use as little kind of pain relief as possible. That was my experience. Of course, lots of people have experience where they feel more pressured into more medicalized ways of giving birth. But what that did to me was kind of set up this expectation where what actually happened was 43 hours of mostly incredible pain. And I was very lucky that I was attended to by two midwives throughout most of it, well, the final kind of 12 hours of it, who were so important in holding me in that space. And I think, the sense I get with birth and good birth is that if a person is held by a midwife or a doula or a partner, then that is so, so crucial. I was My birth was textbook. I was lucky that, we were both okay. I had a second-degree tear, but I thought I was going to die. I thought my baby was going to die. It went on and on and on, and the pushing was very long. And I think probably looking back, so it's about 8 years ago, that wasn't even my most traumatic birth. My third birth ended in a really a severe birth injury, which I'm still damaged by. But I think I felt in those moments of extreme pain very abandoned by my society, by culture, very shocked by what felt so big and so almost catastrophic to my body and my mind. And the shock of that has taken some time to recover from. I did have gas and air, and I did have a psychedelic experience in the bathtub, which was probably the best part of the whole journey of labor. I had this amazing trip, and I haven't really heard many people talk about tripping on gas and air. I mean, I hadn't slept for 3 days, so that might have had something to do with it. But I was seeing like gunky slices of volcanic lava cake and a hare in slippers tap dancing. And they were all these figures which felt like they were from my childhood coming to kind of cheer me on and encourage me. And this sense I got was this was always gonna happen. It was always meant to happen, this incredible moment. So it's taken some time to kind of piece together that experience of birth. And then, after the birth happens, and then, as is often the case with people in our society, I entered the quite isolated institution of motherhood, a medical system where the baby is very central and looked after as it must be, but the mother or the birthing person is often kind of forgotten about or is just seen as a feeding machine. And that kind of exacerbated for me, I think, a sense of bewilderment about this big life stage. And I mean, so many things. It's like, it's the biggest thing that's ever happened to me.
Thank
How about
you.
you?
Well, it was so interesting. I was listening to your story, your book on audio, and it made me cry at one point because I had an experience of I suppose my birth was the first to say I had all the same messaging that you had around, you know, the importance of trying to not have pain relief because that would affect the baby. So hypnobirthing, I spent a lot of time hypnobirthing, practicing. I trained for it like a marathon. And really this idea that, I was really trying to live up to this kind of sense of I'm going to have a natural birth at home. It's going to be good for my baby. And actually, I think through sheer luck, it was a 6-hour birth, and she came out in the water, and it was fine. But like you, the actual, like, I think I resonated with a few things that you said. Firstly, the idea that hypnobirthing says that if you do it right, and if you do it this, and if you're relaxed enough, you shouldn't have pain. And I'd been doing all of that, everything. I'd been doing all the guided imagery things and preparing like it was my full-time job. And then, the contractions just, they there's no way you could say that they were like painless. And the moment of crowning, when the baby comes out, and I, like you, thought I was going to die. And I think it's quite common for women to have that moment of feeling. So it really felt to me like an initiation, and an initiation that I also felt with that sense of abandonment and gaslighting by my culture of this was not what I was prepared for. And that I felt incredible sadness that what I felt like what I would have needed is, so in your book you talk about how, you know, birthing used to be a thing. It was kind of like the kind of midwives and the herbal doctors and the aunties and the kind of non-medical professionals would surround women in this kind of, you know, support of women that had also been through it before, in this real sense of, you know, we're holding you, your village is around you. And then it went into hospitals and it became medicalized. The pain relief was looked down upon. So then you have this situation where women are kind of like without the support and maybe the herbal medicines or the, you know, the aunties around them. Like you say, the person supporting you is so important. Like in a psychedelic experience, the guide, the midwife makes all the difference. But it was kind of there. It was like the second setting of birth is completely wrong. And in the same way that we would never expect someone to have a psychedelic experience in a really sterile setting without proper support, without proper like understanding of what they're going into, I felt gaslit. Like, why did nobody tell me that it was going to be like this? And I was horrified, and the horror continued afterwards in the postnatal period, where my body was bleeding for weeks and weeks and weeks, which is completely normal. And no one had ever mentioned that I would need a stack of pretty much nappies because I was going to be bleeding for months. So yeah, the initiation that I felt like I was going through was not supported by the container that I was in.
You put it so well. It's that kind of endemic, widespread kind of denial and disavowal of the female body, the maternal body, of what it takes to birth a child, what a child needs. When I when I had my first child, I felt like I kind of fell through a portal into, you know, actual quite a lot of anger and rage around the kind of gaslighting and the sense not just of like an absence of care, but also active misinformation and myth, um, which which is so unhelpful. I mean, psychoanalysts and thinkers. There's a amazing psychoanalyst called Rosemary Balsam. She talks about the invisible pregnant body and how in Freud there's just nothing about pregnancy, and other academics have talked about how, you know, there's like the invisible postpartum body, and you look at books about pregnancy and birth and so on. You know, they have like next to no information about how to recover. And I think what that does is it seems to make the individual feel ashamed. You know, for example, like when I, you know, I was bleeding so much and all this stuff, it's like, or I was actually thinking and responding emotionally and psychologically and spiritually so much to what had happened. And while, you know, that everyone was telling me, you know, it's all about feeding the baby now, like, you know, that's your job, just recover, whatever. You feed the baby, you get back to work in 9 months. Like, no one really cares about what you've been through. With, you know, the baby's here now. That's the important thing. Um, and oh, I've slightly lost my thread of thought, but that that oh yes, so that experience then I think made me, and I've seen this in much of my correspondence since publishing Matrescence, and I'm sure it's the same in, you know, other transitions in life as well. I imagine it might be similar in menopause. You're having this huge kind of personal experience, your culture and society is telling you basically to shut up and to just get on with it. And then I think that shame, the stigma gets internalized and it gets turned on the self instead. You know, and then I see so many women who, in their matrescence, they become very silent and they're kind of suppressed by these messages, and they're in shock and traumatized by becoming a mother and are careless society. But the lasting violence of that is the suppression and the silencing. But then, of course, once we connect and we are together and we can share this, then we can turn that, you know, that feeling of shame outwards and start to criticize the institutions of motherhood.
Yes. Yes, I love that. In your book, at the end, there's a wonderful chapter about, you know, how to, I can't remember the word now, but it's kind of like,
Macro reform.
yes,
Yeah.
macro reform. And you talk about the importance of starting to have these conversations and starting to talk and starting to really share our experiences together as part of that, amongst other things. But could you, one thing I didn't do at the beginning is to ask you to define matrescence. So anyone listening to this saying, but what is matrescence? Could you tell us what it is?
Yes. So matrescence simply means the process of becoming a mother. It's very like adolescence, so it's like matrescence, adolescence. It was coined by the late American anthropologist and doula Dana Raphael in the 70s. So she wrote about how, in an essay, how most cultures and societies across the world have a sense of a newborn mother. So when someone gives birth, a mother is also born, and there are different rites and rituals and acknowledgements in most societies which recognize matrescence as a significant developmental stage. She compares it to North America, and how matrescence will mean normally being in a hospital and then probably being left by a partner who needs to go back to work, being far away from your kin, and then being quite isolated with no rituals or rites to speak of. And this word has been revived by different academics in the last kind of 10, 15 years. But it's starting to get a bit more movement and momentum now, where I think it's really transformative because it gives us a way of talking about what is a really big transition that lots of women will go through, which has been so neglected and disavowed by our society.
Thank you for defining that. And it, I suppose as well, this idea around the way our culture doesn't recognize matrescence, and as you say, you know, just kind of the isolation and the lack of ceremony and ritual, and this idea of, you know, it's complete disconnectedness from self and others and nature in that time. Really, it's like the opposite for so many women. And I think you said that it's like nearly 50% of women in that phase feel isolated and low. There's very high rates of postnatal depression, not just from people that have postnatal depression in a kind of clinical sense, but for people that just feel, I mean, I remember just feeling really lonely and a bit miserable and exhausted and totally cut off from everything. And of course, you're at the whim of this little being that needs so much. And you talked about the idea of being a machine. So this kind of like, we grew up in the time of Thatcher in the UK, this like industrial idea of like working, be a work machine. Okay, now be a baby machine. Okay, now be a feeding machine, and then go back to being a work machine again. This idea of machines. So if you think about the time of matrescence in a machine culture, in a disconnected late stage capitalist machine culture, and then think of matrescence in the Douglas Fir forest kind of idea of a connected society. What would you have needed when you're what have you needed, and how do you envision the change happening as we move into these more connected times?
What a lovely question. Well, I will say that, you know, I'm really lucky that I have a supportive family and, you know, a loving partnership. And I don't live particularly near my own family, but we have family nearby. But I think one of the things that I needed was something that I'm still trying to unlearn, which is to shake off self-reliance and to become better at asking for help and accepting help. Saying that, I have experimented with asking for help with some certain people, and it hasn't worked, because I think we do live in a culture where our autonomy and our freedom is so prized over our bonds and our relationships. And that doesn't come overnight. I think it's this is a post-war thing, a post-industrialization culture, which we can see people are pushing back on and resisting, and creating kind of kinship bonds and villages, outside the kind of nuclear family unit, which I was amazed to learn in my matrescence, having thought that was the traditional, the way of doing family. This is a modern and failed, I would argue, experiment, when actually we evolved for 95% of our evolutionary history in collective communal caregiving networks. Some really interesting research by a guy called Nikhil Chowdhury at the University of Cambridge in the last year. He's been observing hunter-gatherer groups, and has found that a baby in these traditional societies, which might give us some sense of what our own evolutionary history might have been a bit like, will be responded to by between 10 and 20 people, allo parents, a day. Not just, you know, because not just so the mother can go and forage or do what she needs to do, but so the mother can rest. And they found that the mother actually is only responding to the baby maybe 50% of the time. And I had a sense in my early months of matrescence where I just felt like my nervous system had not evolved for this. I am highly sensitive, and my baby was quite high needs, but there was something about these long stretches of time alone, often with a baby, babies at kind of 7, 8, 9, 10 weeks almost, they can cry for 3 hours a day. And often it's really hard to soothe them. Sometimes babies just, I thought a mother will always be able to soothe the baby. That's not true. Sometimes babies just cry. Um, and, I had a sense that isolation, that level of kind of continuous care was not what I had evolved for. And I eventually was diagnosed with postnatal depression, which was probably maybe anxiety and birth trauma, perhaps, and have had up and down periods since then. But what I have done, which has helped, is as well as medical treatment, which I did need, is finding relief in connection with other people. In the events that I've done for Matrescence, talking to you here, Ros, talking to other people about, our vulnerabilities. That's, for me, that's just the essential balm, the essential soothing balm, which I have needed to kind of pursue. I'm quite a kind of introverted, shy person, but I'm lucky that I've got friends who will keep me kind of come out of my shell. I found, ways of creating like small kind of circles, and that is so important in alleviating some of the kind of stress of it all. But also, I've got a real sense that there is a reservoir of anger and rage and power which is untapped, and people just like so hungry for connecting with others, not being behind a screen all the time, using their senses, not being, just digitally connected, but being together and resisting against the kind of extractive colonial cruel culture that is dominant.
Yes, 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 as to all of that. And it's, so powerful what you say about the importance of those circles and coming together and sharing our stories and talking, and the power that is behind that, and how there is so much there's so much revolution in this, because the way we change in these next years, given the kind of timeframes that we have for huge changes to happen, and it feels very much to me like there will of course be, we're going to see technology advance and AI come more in and all of those things, and we're going to see deep empowerment of local communities, because we're going to need it. We're going to need to share things. There's going to need to be more of a sense of local communities coming together. So it feels like there will be this, you talk about kind of motherhood as a site of empowerment, but this idea around it doesn't only empower mothers to have like the village, the local communities, but everybody. Because when you said that about 10 to 20 caregivers looking after a child, and I've heard that before, this idea of kind of like, we've evolved to live in groups of around kind of 50 people where a child has lots of attachment figures. It makes me, I feel this kind of searing surge of rage, because I think the way I've done it was so hard and so wrong and such a loss for everybody. Because when I imagine sharing this in groups of people, then it means that we all share this work and we all share the joy of children, because they can be so joyful. And rather than it all falling on one person, which really makes it difficult for women, depending on how much support there is around them, to work, as you talk a lot about in your book as well. Like there's this very brilliant passage where you're talking about kind of, your daughter are kind of outside the room saying mummy mummy, and then you kind of end up writing your book with her in your lap, and it's this visceral feeling of like the struggle for women. And we need women in leadership positions, we need women writing books, we need women making decisions, we need women in politics, we need women leaders. We need them to be able to work, not to be a baby machine, not to be tied to this kind of never-ending job. And sharing this in our communities will benefit everybody, because people that haven't had children then get to be caregivers and attachment figures to children if they want to be. And we can all just share in a way that makes complete sense. And it's so radical, because when we can share in that way, our power and our sense of purpose we can do so much when we share. When we don't share, we are all in our individual units being slowly decimated, whether it's by loneliness, disappointment, life didn't meet our kind of consumer expectations, or just through absolute kind of punishing regimes of keeping a household going. It's impossible to work and keep a household going and look after it. I mean, it's just the weight of it is suppressing our radical potential. So how in writing your book and in the work you've been doing, can you talk about any kind of sense you have? We only have a few more minutes left, so just projects or ideas for this kind of radical potential of motherhood and matrescence being a site of a cultural transformation.
Yeah, and you put that so well. I think that the kind of isolated, intensive institution of motherhood today is bad for everyone. It's not great for children. It's not the way it should be. And it's funny how these ideas of children having more different caregivers is radical to us, but actually it's radical in the the root of radical, I think, is root, literally. And actually this is how we lived for so long, is with, and so I think it's not, and I'm not saying let's go back there, but it's not impossible that we could live in a world which was much more communal. So yeah, there's a lot of empowering and radical stuff happening, I think. Firstly, I think, the word matrescence and the focus, there's a lot of focus in like neuroscience and a bit more focus on the female body now in research and so on. And that is basically just showing us what we already know, which is that it is a big deal to become a parent. And also that we're all born with the neural circuitry to give care. So we know that fathers' brains change shape, and caregiver brains, with hands-on affectionate care, all all human brains can change. A baby can change all human brains. It's not just a mother's brain who changes. So we're all able to give care. And so I think what that means is that it both tells us that matrescence is a vulnerable time for new mothers. The maternal mental health statistics are really shocking, really gruesome. The statistics around rising levels of postnatal depression and mental illness. New mothers are at the highest risk of suicide. Chance of depression doubles. It's so unjustly and unequally split across racial and class lines. If we look at this period of like natality, and we really look instead of looking away, we can really see how our society treats the vulnerable and what our society values and cares for. And it's a picture that really needs to change. But I'm excited by some of these initiatives where I think there's one in Clapham and I think there's one in Sheffield where there are nurseries being built into or being brought into nursing homes. And you've got this intergenerational connections happening. I think that's really cool. I'm a big fan of something called matricentric feminism, which is a feminism conceptualized by Andrea O'Reilly. And her idea is that obviously it's not just a feminism for mothers that needs to happen, but that the experience of motherhood is an important thing and needs certain changes to be made in order to support mothers. And I think there are ways of seeking kind of radical, revolutionary, empowered parenting, mothering amongst community, which I find hard because I have this kind of sense of I have to do everything by myself. But I get a sense that other people are much better at me, and it is happening. Kind of women's circles and ways of sharing. You know, I would love to see more kind of community gardens where all different ages come, and because we need gardens to protect us from global heating and so on, and for biodiversity. But I think that could also be a way of bringing people together. I think that the motherhood has been kind of suppressed in Western culture and literature for to a staggering degree for a really long time. But bringing these experiences out into the open more, I think, can only help us to essentially remember that we're all interconnected, we're all interdependent, we're all vulnerable, and being told that we're not is inadequate. Yeah, does that make sense?
Does that makes complete sense? It's beautiful, and I think it is in that place of our shared vulnerability when we realise that we need care, that the real change can happen. When we come out of this long-standing pretense of being, the whole we brought up in this kind of competitive, self-sufficient, self-reliant, we're fine. The more that we can start to say, actually, we are tender, we are sore, we need care from each other, then and open up to be able to give and receive, then I think that is it's going to be a change that will bring such relief when we can let go of all that pretense and start to just get on with the very beautiful work of sharing care and let go of the era of doing it all, when it stops becoming beautiful and starts to become just too much, too oppressive, when it's all on one person's shoulders.
Definitely dangerous, even
dangerous. Yeah. So we need the mother trees, we need the auntie trees, we need the uncle trees, we need all of the whole group to share this work for the next generation and for the generations that come after. So may that be so, and may the next generation have a much gentler and more vulnerable, protected and more honest experience than we did.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for being with us. It's been really good to talk to you, and I hope everyone that's listening to this will get your book if they haven't already, and enjoy it. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. It was lovely to talk to you.